So, talked a little bit about why it is that I'm doing the videos, and other than the fact that they're just fun to make, um, touched on how kind of felt like I wanted to pass some stuff down to the newer gamers and some people who've been at it for a while, just to get another opinion from outside. So, on to what I was going to talk about in this particular video, and really wanted to touch on a subject that I run into a lot because I'm picky. Is player character races that you may not necessarily be a fan of, or you don't want to include in your particular setting. So, I guess the first question to really ask is, if your players want to play a particular race, is there a good reason why not? Besides, I don't have them in my campaign setting, do you have a really good reason why there is not something that could fit that role? And if not, then A, why not just let them play it and find a way to put it into your campaign setting? They can always be from over there, or, the last of a lost race or whatever. But for the most part, there's always a way to work them in, especially if you have a pretty open world. Now, the other thing is, too, is if you don't want to just include the race that you hate, or that race that just you never thought about putting in your world, or that new race that came out that seems suddenly just to appear out of nowhere. For me, that's Tieflings and Dragonborn. Is there a way to bring that into the game that makes it enjoyable for the player who wants to play that kind of character, but maybe thematically is different for your world, for your setting? So that those are the two things that I would really ask yourself as a DM. Can you manage to go ahead and get get this race into the game so your player can play the character he wants to play, and your world isn't rocked? If you've never had halflings in your world and suddenly somebody wants to play a halfling, then you've got to figure out where have all the halflings been hiding all along. And there are certainly ways to do that, and it really isn't going to break your campaign world in too many cases. But there are a couple other ways to do that as well. So first off, let's talk about how to fit them in. So if somebody comes in and says, "Hey, I want to play this race," and you don't already have them written in, or even have gone so far as to have written them out, unless it's thematically just wrong for the setting, and then you can have a talk as a mature DM to hopefully a mature player about that. But at that point, start thinking about the geography of your world, the history of your world, and is there a place in your world where these things could have been hiding? In the Lord of the Rings, outside of the Shire, hobbits really weren't a thing. Nobody really knew about hobbits. So if you had, I'm sure they'd heard about them from time to time, but for the most part, the way it's carried on is there's sort of a reasonable suggestion there that unless you lived around the Shire, most of the world didn't even know what a halfling or a hobbit was. So could it be that in your campaign setting, hobbits or halflings here have been tucked away in some strange corner of the world, on the other side of that forest that really nobody in your civilized setting goes through? Or are they, have they been cut off from the rest of society? Maybe halflings in your setting live on some island somewhere, and the player here is like one of the first of his kind to make it across the sea to the mainland. But the geography is certainly a really good and easy way to separate to find a way to put in those races that you may not have thought about before, or that you just flat out didn't want in your campaign. For me, gnomes and halflings. So, the other thing to consider too is the history of your setting. So maybe these races did exist, but have ceased to exist or were thought gone. And in that case, you are looking at a situation where the player character represents perhaps a lost tribe, or the return of. How cool would that be as a player character to have the DM go, "Okay, I just want you to know you're going to make a halfling, but you are one of the last of your kind. And there are examples of this too, in fantasy fiction and stuff, and that could be fun because that first of all, it gives a good background element. It makes the player's character special, and without giving him anything special. You're not giving him a magic sword, or you're not giving him any special power, but his identity alone is going to make him much more interesting and unique, just for that. And you're really not giving him anything that's going to make him stick out over the rest of the players. In fact, you may be, depending on the background elements there, you may be setting up some sort of a hassle for that player, but in a good way, in a good fantasy way. Your halfling, who has supposedly been gone from the world, maybe wiped out, from the world, is suddenly seen by the king's men. How are they going to react? If the halflings are gone for a reason and they see a halfling, what does this mean to the world? So that's a cool option there, is just to kind of say, hey, what is it that has to happen for this race to reappear? And so, certainly the history of your setting is something to take into account. And if you hadn't written them out for a reason, you just didn't have them in there, but now somebody wants to play one and you're examining the history of your world, maybe it's a way to create a new piece of lore for your setting, for your campaign, that will now explain why it is that this race is back, and what happened to them, because that could be a whole campaign arc in and of itself. What happened to this character's people? Why were they gone? Why are they back? Does everybody know that they were gone? Maybe people don't even know that there were halflings. And suddenly there's a halfling. What is this thing? He looks like a little man with fuzz on his feet. So it comes down to, so we got geography. That's a good way. That's an obvious physical way that you can just, say that they're over there. The other thing is, of course, the history of the world. So that's how you can make stock races come back and come into the world where they were previously written out. And another thing that comes up, though, when dealing with getting rid of races from a game is you are kind of messing with a blend that's worked into D&D. And so another way to handle these races when you're designing your setting, if you don't like a race as a DM, maybe they just don't speak to you, they seem cliche, whatever the issue is, why not change them so they then fit into the world, or so I should say more so that they're present in the world, but not in the guise that everybody knows them as. So, as an example, in one campaign I ran, I already mentioned I don't like halflings and gnomes, and half-orcs are generally one of those things that kind of sticks in my craw too. So I made a campaign setting once, fortunately never got to run it, but I did make a campaign setting once where I decided that half-orcs were not going to be a thing. Orcs and men couldn't crossbreed. And half-orcs are one of those kind of those the holdovers, one of those shades of Tolkien that that just kind of blended their way into Dungeons and Dragons. So I decided that the half-orcs were now going to be replaced thematically by a race descended from giants. They were men. They were descended from giants. This is before things like Goliaths were written into the game. So when Goliath showed up, I'm like, okay, well, you can just, pull out half-orcs and insert Goliaths, and you have that big UG for the player to play. Because the guys who play half-orcs are generally the guys who want to play just the brute character. But in this case, I had decided that this race called the Halfgear, which is more of a Norsey type name, that they were these descendants of giants, and they were what was going to stand in for half-orcs. Stat-wise, they were identical to half-orcs. I may have got rid of their dark vision and replaced it with something else, but really they were just a reskinned half-orc. And at the same time, I decided that I wanted to do something really different for halflings and gnomes. And so what I decided I was going to do is There's just too many mannish races around, so everything is kind of a variation on it. So I decided that halflings and gnomes were now going to be replaced by anthropomorphic animals, not in any kind of weird way, but just kind of in the kind of the red wall, Rats of Nim kind of way, but humanoid in size. So the same size as they would have been before, they're just now humanoid animals, and so halflings were replaced by kind of home-bodied mice, sort of dormouse type characters, and they were now the replacement for the halflings. And then I did for gnomes, they were replaced by hedgehog men. And I kind of wanted, gnomes are always kind of depicted in classical gnomes are kind of these foresty type characters. And so hedgehogs was a good blend for them. And so hedgehogs and these hedgehog men, I used Hurgens, which is an old monster from back in the AD&D days. I used them as now a player race. Just use the stats for gnome, and it escapes me what I ended up calling the mouse men at that point. And I even set up some lore for the world, kind of like I did with the half orcs, where instead of being half orcs with half gear, they were descended from giants. Instead of being a blend of orc and man, the mice and the Hurgens were the last of the ancient animal races, back when all animals walked and talked and were humanoid, kind of but these two, for whatever reason, they had maintained their existence as humanoids. So reskinning is another thing to consider when you're making a campaign setting. And the advantage to reskinning is you're not removing character options as far as stats. Every race brings into the game certain blend of stats and abilities that can be useful. Not that you're ever going to have all of them in a party unless you have a gigantic party, but it does allow for those options. So now the things that make halflings are still there. The things that make gnomes are still there, and the things that make half orcs are still there. So there's still that advantage, and you haven't removed anything from the mix of potential races. So reskinning is a good way to go about doing that, and I'm doing that in my most recent campaign, in the Airlift campaign that I've been using as the title for this series of videos, because that's what inspired me to start doing videos. That and Matt Colville. In Airlift, gnomes and dwarves are not a separate species. Gnomes are just dwarves that didn't go into the ground. Gnomes are, they're statistically they're the same as gnomes, but gnomes never went into the mountains. They never went into the ground, and so they're kind of, for lack of a better term, they are surface dwarves. And so that's just how it worked. And for me, that was a way to reconcile my hatred of gnomes. Because when I think of gnomes, just to explain that for a moment, when I think of gnomes, I always think of my childhood and how I loved the red pointy hat, 3 inches tall, David the Gnome type of characters, and the classic Gnomes book. But and so I can never get my head around that gnomes are not those guys. It's weird, but it's me. So gnomes are now surface dwarves. Halflings are still there. I have them in the setting because in the Airlift campaign, I wanted to make sure that one of the rules I set for myself is anything that was in the player's handbook I wanted to put in there. I'm not quite sure where Dragonborn fit into the world, but I've got a place for them if somebody decides that they want to make one. And tieflings, well, they're easy to fit in because tieflings have always, in my head, been that weird, odd thing. There's no tiefling city somewhere. It's just tieflings happen, and when they happen, they're out there. So we've got figuring out where inserting the species that you wanted that you're not fond of, finding ways in geography or lore or history to do it. There's also reskinning. The other option, too, is if you're not going to have them in there, what are you replacing them with? What is the stand-in? So you're not narrowing the pool of playable races. Now, you don't have to have a huge pool of playable races, and some campaign settings work perfectly well with fewer playable races. There's plenty of fiction and film out there, stuff where all we ever see is men as the characters, but they're in a fantasy setting. So that works. But D&D is about options for the players. It's about players coming to the table and making a character and feeling that they have some choice. So if you're going to write out popular races, halflings are popular. People know The Hobbit. People know The Lord of the Rings. People know Willow, which always struck me as kind of a halfling analog, or maybe a gnome. I guess there's an argument that Willow could be a gnome. But people know these characters and they want to write these characters, they want to play these characters, and they may know them from books and or comics or whatever. If you got rid of elves, you've just hacked off a good probably third to a half of potential D&D players. Elves are everywhere. Everybody loves elves. Just a moment. Excuse me. All right. So if you're going to get rid of the race, what are you going to replace it with? You need to have those options available. So one way is to expand the options from another race. So if you get rid of halflings and gnomes, and we're going to keep harping on halflings and gnomes because they're the ones that always stick out to me. But if you're going to get rid of halflings and gnomes, what do you have in their place? Do you have, and like I said, one way would be to expand on existing races. You can say, it's easy to expand on elves. I think Dragonlance did this pretty well, where they had all of the familiar races. And actually, it's worth stopping for a moment to mention Dragonlance, because Dragonlance, I think, is one of the first cases in D&D history for an official setting where they really tinkered with the stock races. You had dwarves and you had elves, but the elves weren't wood elves and high elves and gray elves like we knew from Greyhawk. They had other names like Kaganesti and Darganesti and Qualinesti and Sylvanesti. And while they were all kind of the same thing, they had their own variation, their own variant spin. But where we really saw some variation is halflings were now Kender, and they were different. They still fit the role thematically, but story-wise, they were really different. I mean, or I should say, they fit the role rules-wise that halflings always did, but they were different. Kender were not halflings. And up until Dragonlance, I can't remember any reference to gnomes being inventors and tinkers. Something that was evidently profound enough to where in products for years after second edition and onto 3.5 and all that, we would see gnomes depicted as tinkers. Gnomes, for me, in AD&D, back in AD&D before Dragonlance, were, they were the illusionists, the gnome illusionist, and so. But Dragonlance really stepped in, and if you're not familiar with Dragonlance, they're definitely worth picking up. If you can get hold of the old adventures, they're really well done, cool maps, lots of story. It's kind of on rails, but you don't care because it's so full and detailed. But, yeah, that was a good example of retheming existing races to make them fit a setting and make it feel different. So back to what I was saying, though. If you're going to get, if you're going to remove races, you need to replace them with something. Well, you don't need to, but you should, just so people have something to play. And one way is to expand on existing races. So now, where your elves traditionally would be wood elf and high elf in 5th edition, depending on what setting you're playing, you've got lots of different elf options, and you can always borrow from other books. If you look into the Forgotten Realms setting, they've got, I think, 4 different variations on elves. I'm not committed that to memory, but those are variations. But you could add more. Maybe elves are now much more diverse in the setting. The other option is to expand. Is to create new races. Now this gets a little trickier and it's a little heavier to do, but you can do it. The new rules have a lot of good guidelines, and there's stuff online too to help you in developing new races for 5th edition and previous editions for that matter. But new races are a way to allow player options after you've weeded out some of the obvious choices. And so, sorry, I got a bit of a scratch in my throat. So from there, one thing I have a campaign setting that I've done in the past, my Valdaria campaign that I've done, where all the player races, all the player characters are assumed to be human. The continent they're on doesn't have elves, it doesn't have dwarves, it doesn't have gnomes. It doesn't have any of those. But what it does, what I have done is I've gone through and written up each of the regional, each of the human regions as a different player race. With the new 5th edition human rules, it's kind of easy to do that because they've either got the option for having +1 in every stat, or now it's like the feat and a proficiency and then +1 and 2 stats. You can easily work with those to write in regional variants, and that kind of harkens back to things like with Conan, where each region has its thing that it's known for. Cimmerians are stout barbarian folk, and the people of Zamora are so. I'm a little shaky on my Conan, but so what you can do is you can go ahead and create humans that are regionally different but play like a different race. And it's even possible to mix it up. You could have, if you don't want to have a character who has those regional distinctions, you just want to kind of make a more generic character, use the standard human rules, +1 in every attribute. If you want to be, in the case of Valdyria, let's say you want to be a Karavosan, well, then you're going to use those particular variations. If you're from Valdyria proper, which is the center of the empire in that setting, you're going to have a certain set of skills and traits that you're known for, but that's not going to be the same all around the empire that you're from. So variant races and new races is a way to go to fill in those blanks. Really, when you're making a campaign world, there's nothing saying that you have to fill in those blanks. There's nothing saying you have to include characters. Just understand that if you're going to remove stuff from the basic rules, you need to make sure that your players know up front that you're doing this and that they know what their options are. Because nothing's going to get more frustrating than having them look through the player's handbook, especially with newer players, looking through the player's handbook, falling in love with something, and then being told that they can't play it. So being flexible and finding a way to work them in, even though you had maybe written them out, is always the best thing. If you can make it work, all the better. But if not, at least be upfront with it. I mean, really, at the end, you're just trying to make sure everybody has a character option that they really appreciate and that they can get into. And if somebody feels like they've been shoehorned into a character role that they didn't really want to play because it was what was left, they're not going to have as much fun. And you want them to have fun. You want them to enjoy playing their character, because the longer we play, the better the game gets, in most cases. Sometimes it drags on, and at that point you can take a break. But campaigns benefit over time. And so the best way to keep a campaign going is to make sure that the players are engaged and that you as in the DM are. And part of that, one of the biggest parts of that starts at their character, who it is. I work with a lot of front loading when I'm helping my players make their characters. And I say that I help my players make their characters, not that I tell them what to make, but I listen to what they have to say, and then I work with them to try and make it fit in. I mean, because especially considering I run a lot of custom campaign settings. When I do run D&D, I've never run a boxed campaign since Greyhawk, and I think I dabbled in Ravenloft and Dark Sun at one point. But for the most part, it's been custom campaigns. So there's no way that the players can know the world to the same degree I have, because A, they don't have time to generally read all the all the material that might be there, and really I don't have the time to write an entire guidebook to the campaign settings that I'm running, because I got a family and I got a job. That's not facetious. That's the truth. I have other things and other hobbies and other responsibilities that I really can't spend all that much time writing everything up. Now I do write a lot, but even still, I can't expect every player to memorize that stuff and commit to it before they come to the table. So really know what your players are going to want, and work with your players to make sure that they have the characters they want. And one of the things that's really going to affect that is what races are available. So try to make races fit. If you can't, try to come up with substitutions. And then if you can't do that, at least make sure that you're absolutely clear what it is that you're omitting from your campaign, why it's omitted, and try to figure out with that player what fits their idea, what in your world fits their idea for their character. Because maybe a halfling isn't there. You can't reconcile it. The halfling's never going to be there. So what is there that would give them the same play style? What is it that they can make, that will fit the role? Maybe, instead of a wise, halfling rogue, they're going to play a little person. Maybe they're going to play a human who has, dwarfism, or whatever congenital condition, or that makes him small. Think of Tyrion in Game of Thrones. Tyrion is not a dwarf in the classic fantasy sense, but he fits sort of that role anyways. I mean, if somebody wanted to play a dwarf or a halfling or a gnome in a campaign that doesn't have them, why can't they play a Tyrion character? Or some other reasonably explained one-off solution. So, and that could be a very cool thing. So again, there are plenty of options, and certainly mine aren't always going to be the best. And my garage heater is kicking in, so it's probably a good time to close down this particular video. But consider why your races are gone, and if you can find a way to put them in there, make sure that they're there. Work with it if you can. Geography, history, things like that. Alternatives, and then just flat out, stay flexible. Enjoy your game. Everybody else will enjoy the game. Just make sure everybody's having fun. All right, that's it. Have a good one.